You've heard this saying because it's become quite popular, diversity is our strength. And now, in the natural world, there is some beauty in naturally occurring diversity. However, this forced DEI type of diversity, that idea is rubbish.
Hello, listeners. Thank you for being here. You are tuning into the Feds podcast. I am your host for today, Vice President of Feds for Freedom, Cameron Hamilton. It's an absolute honor to have you. Please tune in to all the Fed podcasts that are coming up. We've got some fantastic people, lovers of liberty, those who are willing to push back against the narrative and are willing to stand boldly for service as it was meant by the founders. So God bless you all. Please follow our Substack, go to fedsforfreedom.org and follow what we're doing, and let us find a way to advocate for you.
Welcome to the Feds, insiders bringing accountability, integrity, and reform to a broken bureaucracy. At Feds for Freedom, we value constructive dissent and healthy debate. The views and opinions shared in today's episode are those of the speaker alone and do not express the views or opinions of the U.S. government or any other employer.
So we've got a wonderful individual that's going to be joining us today for the podcast on the Feds, Mr. Matt Lohmeier, Lieutenant Colonel retired. Matt stood for liberty and freedom. He created a lot of waves by testifying before Congress, radically pushing against the intrusion of politics into our armed forces. Matt is a warrior, a patriot, and also a lover of liberty. And we are absolutely honored to have him on this podcast. So tune in. This will be a great episode, and we hope you stand by. All right. Thank you all for being here. We have our distinguished guest, Mr. Matt Lohmeier. Matt, God bless you, my friend. Thank you for being on the Feds podcast.
Hey, happy to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So first off, I always like to get to know the guests that we have coming on this show. And you are a pretty remarkable individual. You've accomplished so many things, but we don't get to hear it from your perspective. So if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about how you grew up, where you grew up at, what inspired you to want to join the service, and a little bit about your family and your history.
Yeah, I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, and didn't really have a lot of military background or experience in my family. My dad was a UPS package delivery driver. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, and I was the oldest of 4 kids, and had an uncle that flew planes for the Air Force, but didn't know much about his career and wasn't necessarily close to their family. It was through being recruited to play basketball. We had a state championship basketball team there in Tucson and won state championship my senior year. But beginning my sophomore year, the Air Force Academy coaches took notice of me. They had come to watch a different player on our team who was a senior while I was a young sophomore. And I had one of the better games of my high school career as a sophomore, and Air Force took notice. The Air Force recruiting team and head coach was in touch with my family after that, came and ate dinner with my family in the home in Tucson, and persuaded me and my parents that it was a good idea that I give up all hopes of playing in the NBA someday and consider a military career at the Air Force Academy, which I did. And they flew me out for a recruiting visit for a football game, and I got to see a B-1 bomber fly overhead at the game.
Wow.
And rumble the stadium, which was very impressive.
Awesome.
And of course, they had to hide from me all of the terrible yelling and oppressive life that the freshmen at the academy were undergoing, because they wanted to make me think it was a lovely place, not a terrible place. And so they hide that from the recruited athletes, and you get a big wake-up call when you show up there on day one and they shave your head and start yelling orders at you. But I ended up going to the Air Force Academy and played basketball only for 1 year there. It just wasn't as fun anymore, trying to balance military commitments and basketball life. And I decided I would pursue the pilot path, and that's kind of how I got my start in the Air Force. Was going there, being surrounded by good leaders of character, learning about the honor code, not to lie, steal, or cheat, or tolerate those that do, and they were trying to forge men of character who were honest and had integrity, and that was a really important, shaping, formative period of my life.
That's remarkable. Yeah, they wanted to convince you that the Air Force Academy was going to be a summer vacation.
Yeah, we have lots of discipline here, but we won't show you how we force that upon you when you get here. But yeah, they take all of your rights, essentially, your free speech. They take that from you. You can just say yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, no excuse sir, sir I do not know. I mean, you have your basic responses like you do in any boot camp, They take your civilian clothes from you. They take your vehicle from you, and you no longer have driving privileges. You didn't have cell phones when I went through as a freshman, so you can use the payphone once each week on the weekend if you earned it. And that loss of liberty was really a tangible object lesson for us to know what it feels like to not have your freedom. And so as you begin to get your freedom back as a sophomore and a junior and a senior, you get different rights basically added to your life again. You really appreciate just how tangible liberty is, and you get a sense for what it feels like to live in a totalitarian regime, which should be a hell of a wake-up call to any good officer that we've got serving who came out of our service academies. If we were still doing things the same way, they'd recognize at once that everything we've been seeing, in fact, for the past 4 years, smells and feels an awful lot like your freshman year at the academy, where you start to have censorship of, it's a lean in towards totalitarian dictatorial spirit, where the state is interested in taking rights and oppressing a citizen, controlling the citizens' movements and speech and thought. It's everything you got to experience at the Air Force Academy in a sense, although it was abrupt there, and it's very subtle and subversive the way that governments do it because they're good at it. But yeah, and yet you don't have that broad, sweeping recognition by all of our officers who came out of our service academies that that's precisely the kind of threat we're facing today, but it is.
Wow. So well said. I'm really glad you drew the comparison of the introduction of your liberties and freedoms caused you to appreciate them more. It's remarkable how many people, I think, in this country, especially, and really in Western Europe in that sense, if they don't experience what it's like to lose those freedoms, they never
Right.
fully appreciate them. So it's really unique that you had that opportunity to experience that firsthand in a very tangible and palpable way, the likes of which most in the West would never even come close to experiencing, although we are starting to see some
We're
of that
starting
now.
to see it.
Yeah, that's the truth. So one question I wanted to ask you as well is, what does it mean to serve for you? What is service to country, service to family, service to nation? What is your ideal embodiment of service?
Service. When I showed up at the academy, there was a saying that was in big bold letters on the ramp that leads up into the cadet terrazzo area where cadets walk back and forth to class each day. That saying was, "Bring me men." And it apparently in our current cultural context became offensive enough that they needed to remove it and instead put up these core values, which are good in and of themselves. Although it's interesting, we started to lose touch with those values the moment we removed "Bring Me Men." It's interesting. The same spiritual impulse that caused us to remove "Bring Me Men" and put up those core values was the very thing that undermined those core values, which it's just a terrible irony. But those core values were service before self, and I'm going to talk about that for a second. Integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do. And in that phrase, service before self, is a part of my understanding of what service really means in the first place. Serving is, in its essence, putting others before you, others' needs, security, and interest before you, which is the very purpose of a government in the first place. It should be serving the people. Instead, it's making the servants of the people for its own ends. And there's a number of different ways to approach this, but in a secular sense, a material sense, a military sense, those greatest leaders were willing to put their own flesh on the line for their troops,
Right.
they were willing to lead a charge and not just tell other people what to do.
Live
They
by
were willing to
example.
go headlong into the battle. In a spiritual sense, it's the kneeling servant. It's the master who's willing to kneel and wash the feet of his own disciples. And people have written books about that kind of thing. And so I love the phrase that's on that old "Bring Me Men" ramp, service before self, because it instills at once in the psyche of the military man and woman what the true essence of that service looks like. It's being willing to die for your country. It's taking an oath to support and defend the Constitution against all of its enemies, foreign and domestic, and losing your own life if necessary in the pursuit. And so that's true in a military sense, in a spiritual sense, and there are other ways. I've talked to a lot of people who are discouraged about the direction of the United States military right now, and they say, well, how is it that I'm supposed to serve? Because that was their avenue for service. And a lot of good people are suggesting, look, there are other ways you can serve your fellow man and you can serve your local communities by becoming involved in the community, whether it's in the church or in the secular sphere, in the political sphere. You can run for school boards. You can do all these things that allow you to interact with your fellow human beings in a way that betters their life in your community.
Yeah, beautifully said. I think that's spot on. Service to others, again, you value. It's a basic value judgment. You're putting the needs of the many or the needs of the culture, the needs of the specific operation, this mission, you name it. You're putting that above your own personal comfort. We would always have an expression in the SEAL teams. I spent 10 years as a SEAL. It was team gear, your gear, you. You take care of your team gear first, then you take care of your gear, then you take care of yourself. The idea there is your comfort is not important. Making sure that you're operationally capable, making sure that you're capable of doing the mission in which the taxpayers have sent you to go do, making sure that you had readiness, vehicles were refueled and such so that you could protect your fellow service member, your fellow operators and do the job. And that was always more important than your own personal comfort or even your own ambition.
Right. In fact, let me tie in, we may get here at some point in the interview, but I've been an outspoken critic. I've been an outspoken critic for several years of the diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings our military service members or federal agencies have undergone, which is steeped in critical race theory. Critical race theory itself is an outgrowth, an arm, a child of the critical school and cultural Marxist thought. Those things undermine the ability of our young men and women in uniform to serve appropriately, because what it does instantly is it develops in their psyche a self-focused, identity-focused narrative of world events where they start to focus all about their needs, wants, desires, and how the other is oppressing them or how they've become a victim of the other. And instead of instilling in our service members the kind of self-sacrificing warrior ethos that they need to have to properly serve their country and to develop a proper leadership mindset or followership mindset, we're turning them into monsters of a sort who are only interested in themselves and only interested in what they deserve or what they're entitled to. And we've seen it in university campuses for a very long time. And it's the last thing you want to see in men and women in uniform. Like, there's a reason you all get the same ugly haircut. You all get the same uniform. You're told you bleed the same color. And all of the stuff that always used to matter when you were growing up stops to matter when you get in uniform. It's like, hey, guess what? Your mission is to be here to kill and die. And your mission is to do, fill in the blank, whatever it is you're trained in and becoming an expert in. And then all of a sudden along comes race identity politics as one example. And it's an invitation to consider how you matter more than service to others.
Right.
It's really the wrong place for that kind of nonsense.
Yeah, you're spot on. That's, again, excellent. I had an opportunity to see some of that on display as well with two guys who were in separate groups. It was a social setting about to get into a fight. And next thing you know, somehow they deduced that they were both Marines. And immediately the tension is cut and they shake hands and said, hey, brother. And they actually embrace. To be very clear to the viewers here, these are two people who do not have the same melodic tone. I'll put it that way. Very different ethnic groups. You had one which was largely African-American, one that was very Caucasian. But these two individuals put aside everything. And the conflict had nothing to do with race. It just so happened that these were peer groups that were at odds over a given issue in a bar or something. And so when they embraced and said, hey, brother, we're on the same team, man. And it was two jarheads shaking hands. And you see all their friends saying, well, what the heck is going on? I thought we were about to throw down. And that's where you see the embrace and the humanity, the goodness of humanity that I think God has given us that we rarely see nowadays, because we're almost taught, like you had said, to have a hatred of mankind. It's this hyper self-focus of I've been assaulted, I've been wronged. We have to correct something that's unnatural in man. And it really is a vilification for seeing human beings as having worth and value. It's quite the opposite. And so it's destructive. It's terribly destructive.
It is. You've heard this saying because it's become quite popular, diversity is our strength. And now, in the natural world, there is some beauty in naturally occurring diversity. However, this forced DEI type of diversity, that idea is rubbish. In fact, the story that you've just told shows exactly the opposite, that they were about to throw down, but it was their unity, their common bond that made them strong and recognize that there was something that they could agree on and have peace over. And that's what's made the United States military lethal and ready and successful, is the common bond, the unity that they have. In fact, I've got it on this poster behind me. The middle saying there, unity, not division. That's what's always made a military strong.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I absolutely agree. Well, when did you see, since obviously we're talking about DEI and you've made quite a bit of public spectacle of, your engagement with Congress, and you've spoken at so many different venues, and you also spoke on a certain stage just last Friday.
Yeah.
You got a lot of notoriety too. From your perspective, and I want to get to that here in just a minute, but from your perspective, when did you really first start to see this overt politicization within the military? Was it an incident? Was it a series of events? Was it sort of a season of your time?
It was an event and then a series of events, but I had to get the right lens scratched into my noggin before I was able to see clearly. And it doesn't surprise me that for some people serving in uniform, it takes them a long time to really recognize what's going on around them. They just don't have the eyes to see, because the eyes that we have is shaped by our understanding, our learning, our culture. I had spent a couple of years in school, not broader academia, but DoD schools, studying military strategy. And we spent a lot of time studying the Cold War history. And I dug into Marxist revolutions and ideology, read the Communist Manifesto for the first time in my life, like in 2018. And while I had been a student of history and aware of the evils of totalitarianism entirely, I'd never really given a dedicated study to Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, communism. And so I went down that path in the couple of years before I took command in the Space Force, which happened in June of 2020. That time period was in the month right after George Floyd's death, and rioting throughout the country, and the prominence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I had seen an interview with some of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. Alicia Garza was one of them. Patrice Kahn Colors, I think is what she goes by. She's married to a woman who goes by they, whose name is Future Khan, if that doesn't tell you something about her ambition.
That's right.
And they said in their interview, which I think was done, if I remember correctly, in 2015, it was reported on in maybe the San Francisco Chronicle, if that's a paper. And they said, we're trained organizers, we're Marxists.
Mm-hmm.
We believe in Marxism. And
That's right.
once, as soon as I heard that, and then went and looked at the Black Lives Matter website online in 2020, where they talked about destroying or tearing down the Western prescribed nuclear family, their hatred for capitalism, I thought, okay, this is an overtly political, radical left-wing organization. And I started to see my base commander at the base right after I had taken command in June of 2020, parroting the Black Lives Matter movement talking points. He told his base, no one at my base will stand in the way of the Black Lives Matter movement. And mind you, this was at a time when the DoD, the whole country, was so afraid of and uncertain about the COVID origins, what it might do to us. There was a rush to get the vaccine done, and it was making people very sick. And so there was a lot of concern. And so that's when we started seeing social distancing, mask wearing, mask mandates, and so forth. And so you combine that revolutionary moment of Marxist revolutionary tactics with it was combined with Antifa. It was an anti-government, anti-American, anti-white, anti-Christian, anti-order revolutionary moment that I recognized at once because of my learning from the previous few years. This is Marxist in nature. There's no mistaking it, but it took educating myself for a little while beforehand to be able to see clearly what that was.
Yeah.
And so that's the first time in my military career that I thought, okay, something is happening in the country, and I'm seeing it in the military as well, that is overtly political. It is overtly Marxist. And you use that phrase, and people looked at you like you'd grown an extra head, and they say,
Right.
we don't need more McCarthyism. Joe McCarthy had his day. He was totally wrong, which he wasn't, by the way.
No, he was
And
not.
we know that more now than ever before.
Exactly.
There's a great history I've got here. In fact, Blacklisted by History. I've got the book over my shoulder here. It's a biographical sketch of Joe McCarthy and a revisiting of his efforts to destroy communism in the U.S. government.
A lot of his principal concern was really saying that a lot of his concern was just that, hey, you've got people with a radical ideology that have infiltrated our government at various different levels. That
That's
was
right.
the premise of what he was arguing, and history has
And he was
proven that to
denigrated.
be categorically true.
He was demonized. Now, he got some things wrong, but he got more right than he got wrong. And we couldn't prove it during his lifetime. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, I'd have to go back and look at the book. I don't remember what the name of the documents were that we uncovered and that were unclassified from the Soviet Union. It totally vindicated Joseph McCarthy's efforts. It's unbelievable. And so that book, Blacklisted by History, is a great read because it lets the reader see clearly what was going on. Here's a man who's sometimes on a hunch and sometimes with good gouge, trying to destroy domestic enemies who threaten the United States government and who had aims to undermine the U.S. government. And yet today in 2024, when all of us should know better, but few do, you're labeled a McCarthyist as if it's a pejorative.
Right.
When you start to say, hey, Marxism has reared its ugly head. It never has gone away, and it's taking the form of the Black Lives. It's using the Black Lives Matter movement, and it's using the federal agencies. And there are believers who wear the uniform of their country, who are general officers, who would rather see that succeed than, heaven forbid Trump ever get back into office, the boogeyman Trump. And so you have this divide that's occurring that is in part, not entirely, but in part fueled by the divisive rhetoric of Marxists. And so, in fact, I just spoke in Arizona, Cameron, a couple of weeks ago. I'm going back next week. And in the remarks that I gave, I mentioned this term Marxism. And one of the old veterans who was in the crowd afterward, he came up to me and said, phenomenal remarks, but I just have to warn you about using that phrase Marxism. You lose your audience when you use that phrase, and I'd recommend you find a different one. And I said, well, you got a better way of describing what's going on? Because having looked into this, I'm not interested in shying away from the terms that properly describe some of what's happening. And he didn't have a better suggestion, of course. He just said, you need to make sure you capture your audience. And, at this point, it's like, I've just recognized that it takes every person a little bit different amounts of time to kind of get caught up to speed on what's going on and to recognize the vocabulary for what it needs to be. And, but it's a hard battle. It takes many years for people to wake up to some of the things, usually too late, unfortunately.
That's the truth. I'm actually glad you used the word Marxism as opposed to just socialism or communism, because those can be sometimes rather amalgamous. And you see, political governance of those philosophical systems are not always consistent. For example, communism in Vietnam looked categorically different than communism in other countries because they opened up their economy. They had to promote private wealth and private industry in a way that is inconsistent with the Communist Manifesto or Das Kapital written by Marx.
Mm-hmm.
So when you reference the word Marxism, you're actually giving credence to the origins of these theories. And I think, Marx, well, who is Marx? Well, who is this individual? So Marxism, I think, invokes curiosity where people should realize this is not just a political governance model. This is an actual ideology. And I'm encouraged what more people are learning about Marx, because people don't realize too, Karl Marx, at the same time he's writing some of his works, his most published works, he was also an acclaimed poet. And some of his personal writings talk about literally letting the vapors of hell fill his brain. He has poems written about he and his wife, because of their love, committing suicide in grotesque and vile ways. I mean, this is a man who was deeply disturbed, and we should see the lens of his political philosophy through that. Because to understand, is this someone that actually wants the betterment and improvement of mankind, or was this someone who, as some of his counterparts would claim for him later, that he sought to bathe Europe in blood?
100%. In fact, you mentioned his poetry, so I just grabbed a copy of my book here, which is, this isn't my copy. I've just signed this to put in the mail to send to someone else. So um, who is this one for? This is for Christina. I'm going to read from Christina's copy. One of the poems that Marx writes, and it's early on in his life, I believe. I think he's a teenager when he writes this, and it's called An Invocation of One in Despair. And something happens in his life when he's a teenager where he doesn't stop believing in God. He has a hatred for God and a vengeance that he needs to exact on God. He says, "So a God has snatched me from my all in the curse and rack of destiny. All his worlds are gone beyond recall. Nothing but revenge is left to me. On myself, revenge I'll proudly wreak. On that being, that enthroned Lord, make my strength a patchwork of what's weak. Leave my better self without reward. I," Marx, speaking as if he's Satan here, "shall build my throne high overhead. Cold, tremendous shall its summit be, for its bulwark superstitious dread, for its martial blackest agony." He then, in another poem, talks about, he says, "My soul, once true to God, is now chosen for hell. Thus heaven I've forfeited, I know it full well." I mean, the guy transforms into something that is quite dark. And of course, people are interested in quickly dismissing that today, but it's an important part of the person who then later, not many years later, ends up being commissioned by the Communist League to pen a manifesto for the communists to properly lay out, hey, what are our aims? Well, it's revolution. And we'll sow the proper narrative that will, it's really fascinating. They're going to seize the narrative that best divides the people so that they can create a revolution. It's very clear if you read the 4-part Communist Manifesto. And there's a call at the end, a call to action for revolution. Of course, it was a working class against the capitalist bourgeoisie, leading class, the oppressor class. Mm-hmm. But that narrative morphs and reshapes and wears different masks and goes by different names at different times in history, and as best suited to sow division required for revolution in any age. And right now it's race identity politics in America. We've got a checkered past with that, and it flies right in the face of the ideas and ideals that shaped our country and made it great. And so no better narrative to seize upon and divide people than to get them focused on race identity politics.
Yeah, remarkably said. It's funny, Frederick Douglass, he talked about how hoping that the promises of the American Constitution would come to full forbearance, and that we were falling short during the time of segregation, during the time of slavery and many other things. And so it wasn't so much the belief that, well, this constitutional republic is awful. No, we just have to fully uphold the oaths in which we proclaimed that we would have.
Right.
And so we got there, obviously through very troubled means and a very checkered past, as I'm glad you elaborated, because we have to have humility to recognize our nation's not perfect. We've gotten many things wrong, but there's so little context put in the world for the time and seasons. And I'm, really excellent that you mention all of that. And I think it's...
One more thing I just have to add in there, Cameron, because you mentioned Frederick Douglass. A biographer of Frederick Douglass named Timothy Sandifer, who's an attorney who lives in Arizona, he joined me on stage. He spoke right before me at this last Arizona event that I mentioned, and I liked his book so much that I'd read a couple of years back. I shared it with my troops, and it was during all the Black Lives Matter stuff. I read this biography of Frederick Douglass. I don't have it. I was going to say the name, but I think it's like just called Frederick Douglass. Self-Made Man is what it's called. I brought it as the primary text from which I was going to be speaking, knowing that I was following Timothy Sandifer on the stage. And so I read from that book a few passages about Frederick Douglass that to me convinced me that while he doesn't fit neatly into our modern boundaries or definitions of Republican Democrat, he would have absolutely abhorred the Black Lives Matter movement. Oh, and he was quite critical of what he called Black pride and Black nationalism, and was very much in favor instead of what he called Americanism as he had come to understand it. Yeah. He was a remarkable man. Yeah, really, really remarkable. You talk about people transcending great conflict and coming out stronger from it. That's just absolutely incredible. What, in your experience dealing with this, because obviously you had sort of inculcated your mind with understanding and interpreting communism, interpreting, Marxism and all the different attributes from this
social reorder, this unnatural and frankly evil social reorder that was taking place in so many elements. You started seeing it a little bit in the military. What was the time that you started to really push back in a very vocal or public manner? Was it one event? Was it a series of events? When was that? And did you have people that shared your opinion, either publicly or silently?
I had people privately sharing my opinion, very afraid to speak up about it in the military. Understandably, they were afraid of being labeled racist if they spoke up against the party line. They were afraid of being labeled politically partisan, even though it shouldn't be considered partisan in the United States of America to criticize Marxist ideology or communism, which is, I mean, we committed blood and treasure to fight that cause for the past century, over half century. And it's amazing that it's turned into what we call a partisan issue. It tells you something about the Democrat Party. But also, recognized that summer of 2020 that we had a big problem, and that spirit was rapidly transforming the culture of even the military. And instead of being public about that, I spent months trying to privately, using my chain of command, give feedback about what I was seeing and how it was dividing our troops. I filed a formal written inspector general's complaint about
Good for
the
you.
base commander's anti-American trainings he was giving, about his criticism of the Trump administration, which, having done that from his official role as a base commander, should have had him court-martialed. And he's now a one-star general. And by the way, I hope we do get to revisit this meeting I had last Friday with President Trump in North Carolina, because we'll get there in a minute. But
Yeah, absolutely.
assuming I get a chance to do what Trump suggested I do after the election, there will be court-martials and accountability for people who have been rabid political animals in uniform.
Good.
So
We need it.
yeah, we need accountability if we're going to restore trust in the United States military. So I privately and internally began pushing back and providing feedback. It was mild feedback, but it was direct and it was straightforward, and it fell on deaf ears because people were afraid. Even senior leaders who maybe shared our worldview, let's say, they were afraid to push back. And then the election happened in 2020. And when the Biden administration came to office in January of 2021, I recognized that the problem was getting far worse very quickly. Even by executive order, diversity and inclusion trainings were surging, and there were people pledging to get out of the military because of how overtly left-wing politicized the military had become. And the Christian conservative worldview was being demonized as a threat or a terrorist threat, which is just unconscionable in this country. And so you started to see recruiting and retention plummet and all of the things that we're very well aware about. So I decided to write and publish my book, Irresistible Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
I published it in May of 2021, was fired from my command for publishing it. And that's the time in which I decided I would be very public and outspoken about what was going on. And it took a little time, but, month after month, not only did I have privately overwhelming support from active duty troops and veterans who were very grateful someone was speaking out from a position of knowledge and trust within the military and having been in command, but also I saw others having courage and trying to speak up. And some did that well and respectfully, and others did that with the best of intentions, but maybe disrespectfully or even illegally, from official positions, and get in trouble and or get thrown in the brig. Stu Scheller is one of those. He had great courage to speak up, but he did do something that was illegal, it's against the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Publicly criticizing your chain of command and the commander-in-chief in his uniform on camera, that'll get you sent to the brig. But that was happening in the previous administration, but left-wing activists never got held accountable for that kind of thing.
You're absolutely correct.
Yeah, so that was when I started to try and publicly push back, and I haven't stopped since. It's been, I guess it was really the summer of 2021 through today in the fall of 2024, I've been trying to be outspoken about it.
Excellent. Well, I do want to make sure that we give your book a good shout out. So if you don't mind, hold up a copy of that real quick.
Yeah.
Irresistible Revolution is a timely and bold contribution from an active duty Space Force lieutenant colonel who sees the impact of a neo-Marxist agenda at the ground level within our armed forces. A really remarkable book. I'm halfway through it. It's a great read. And I will encourage anyone, if you're a student of history, you're going to eat up a lot of the stuff that
That's true.
you contribute in there. And it is remarkable how people seem to have almost a cognitive dissonance for history. We've completely forgot some of the virtues in the past. Patton, even for that matter, after World War II, he was so deeply concerned about what was happening on the East with communist Russia and what that meant for Europe. His whole point was, okay, so we just beat the Germans. We now need to train, refit. We've got another war that we have to go fight because this socialist republic is going to engulf so much of the West. It'll be an unchecked force. And he was vilified. No, the war is over or coming to an end. We don't need more conflict. And I understand that. World War II took such a significant toll on the world. But I think Patton and several others saw this monster that was coming. And they really wanted to make sure that we were ready and prepared to deal with it. So in writing your book, what was probably the best experience or best outcome that you had as a result of writing that?
On a personal level, I supposed it solidified for me as an individual certain views of history and ideology. You can study something for a long time, and unless you try and put it in writing, sometimes things don't quite just stick forever. And personally, that was quite satisfying. There's a surety of knowledge that you gain when you do the homework. And so I found myself frustrated with others who don't get it or who disbelieve that this is in fact what is happening. Call it cultural Marxism, postmodernism, leftism, whatever the label it wears, there's a related spirit. And
you go through all those in your book, which is great.
That's right. And in fact, one of the terms I don't use in my book because it wasn't yet in vogue is wokeism and woke. In fact, I don't think the word shows up in my book, and I wrote it in the early months of 2021. So it tells you how quickly our vocabulary changes. Just a few short years and everyone's using different terms, right? And in fact, some of our DoD and Military Service Academy positions and offices that were once called just a few years ago diversity and inclusion related jobs, in order to skirt law and funding issues based on legislation, have just changed the name of their offices. So they're undercover. They're called by the names such as resiliency or force planning. And it's like, you never would know what is going on in those offices. But these force planners and resiliency offices show up every day just focused on how they can
inject politics into the workplace where it shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, I was trying to refrain from saying the way it came to my mind, beat Whitey over the head, which is, that's the slang way of putting it. It's like, these people need a real job, and we shouldn't even have them in government funded positions. But
that's one of the things I love about your stories, that you merit people who come from every diverse background you could imagine, and you testified in front of Congress to that effect about people that, you have a transgender airman that worked for you. You had a superior officer who was African-American, and you believe in merited action and merited recognition based upon performance. And that's really what we need again. And there's so many in the federal government that have seen those testimonies in the military and said that we need that too at HHS, at DHS, at the Department of State. I mean, you name it. These agencies have become so progressively left. And
they have.
I love the title of your book, Irresistible Revolution, because I think it references that the revolution is the movement. They hop from one cultural group to another, but the revolution is what sustains it, because that's where the actual movement is.
Right. Earlier we mentioned one of the Black Lives Matter organization organizers or founders, her wife, Future Khan, was the one, I think, borrowing the phrase from someone else that said the role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. And so they chose a slogan called Black Lives Matter that they knew that no decent human being could resist.
Exactly.
It doesn't matter your political bent. It doesn't matter your race. It doesn't matter. If you're a decent person, of course Black Lives Matter. And those same people started to try and say, well, all lives matter. You're like, all lives matter. How dare you assert all lives matter? This is not about that. This is about Black Lives Matter, they'd say. And so they really did do a great job branding and bullying, forcing compliance, coercing the human psyche. And they've done it through slogans. They've done it through branding. In fact, I'm filming a movie right now. I mean, I'm done filming it. It's almost out. It's a feature-length documentary about my book and my career and what's going on in the country and in the military. One of the places that we went to film was in Minneapolis, on the streets of Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed.
Mm-hmm.
I almost bite my tongue when I say that. I usually try and say where he died, because I know there's debate about whether he was killed or whether he died of drug overdose. Tragic nonetheless. But he has a shrine that's been erected around where he died, and that's on the street there. All of the businesses have been shuttered. It's unsafe to go there. We had armed escorts bring us into the area because you'll be bullied right out of that street if you're not one of the locals. And it no longer belongs to the city of Minneapolis, is what it says there. It belongs to George Floyd and his supporters. And so we got footage there, but one of the things you see spray painted all over the walls of the buildings, the gas station that's now not operational, is Chinese writing, which is really interesting to me. I was there with Xi Van Fleet, who escaped Mao's Cultural Revolution as a young girl and now lives in Virginia. And she was walking the streets with me, and on camera she's pointing out some of the Chinese slogans that came right out of Mao's Cultural Revolution, painted right on the walls of Minneapolis there. There's the raised fist signal that's both a symbol of what we call black pride, black nationalism, but also of the communist revolution. And it's all over the Marxist revolutions, all over the world, and almost every country that you can find Marxist revolutionary cause. You see the raised fists, you see people kneeling and apologizing for their privilege, you see banners and slogans going up and being painted all over the place. It all looks the same. And so we capture that in the film. There's no mistaking that that's exactly and precisely how that crisis was leveraged for the revolutionary cause to make it irresistible.
Exactly. Yeah, so well said. So remarkably said. So tell me a little bit about STARS. You're working with STARS now, and we want to hear about that organization and how people can get in touch with y'all there.
Yeah, let me say up front before I forget that the website is STARS with 2 R's, as you can see over my shoulder there, stars.us. It is perhaps the best one-stop shop online for all things military culture, woke military culture. We've got troops that have, from every branch of the military, unsolicited. We've gathered in feedback that they've posted online or sent to us directly. We've got I think it's now a 200-page document. It's called a boots on the ground perspective from our troops, all talking about the trainings they're receiving that relate to diversity, equity, and inclusion, transgenderism, wokeism, the COVID shot mandates, all of the above. That's all there. We've got a team, an outstanding team of volunteers who both write articles. It's an education-based nonprofit. It's nonpartisan. It is pro-American. And we'll welcome any Democrat or Republican to come and support our work. It doesn't matter to us. They just need to understand that there's a Marxist spirit and ideology underpinning a lot of the training that our military troops are experiencing. And it's our aim to educate people about that so that we can rid the military of that influence. And it's a phenomenal organization. It was founded by retired general officers and Air Force Academy graduates, predominantly in the start, who formed the organization about the same time I wrote my book back in May of 2021. And so I've known them ever since the beginning of the founding of the organization, and it has grown quite a bit and has a good following and support. And it's having reach. We've got an educational outreach, not just to the American people, but we've developed great relationships with members of Congress who are listening well. We provide them information that we get, and I brought some of that information with me, as you mentioned, when I went to testify before the House Oversight Committee's National Defense Subcommittee in January of 2024.
Excellent.
And I brought that, what was then, I think, maybe 160 or 180 pages of boots on the ground perspective to submit for the record in Congress.
And those testimonials you gave have gone viral all over the internet, which is excellent, which I'm really glad to see, because I think your comments during that testimony about how the service member, they don't care about all this stuff. They just want to,
they don't care.
They want to live their lives. They want to know that they have a good mission. They want to know that their command supports them. They want to eat hot chow. They want to provide for their family, and they want to get on. And it was a good reminder of all this fantastical things that we talk about in these legislative bodies. Half of it, the average American could care less.
They're not thinking about that stuff. That's
Exactly.
right. But then they show up to these awkward trainings and they're like, me, the bad guy? Why? Because I'm white? Or the black kid sits there and says, I'm oppressed? Like, I
Right.
thought I was his equal here in
Exactly.
uniform. Like, why are you telling me that he's a bad guy and I'm a good guy? So, in fact, I've mentioned before, and you brought it up, I had a black commander who was the best leader if not the best, among the best leaders I've ever worked for. I really respected the guy. And he was just so talented. And how do you think he feel? He's now a general officer. I think he's wearing 2 stars now. He's probably going to wear 3 stars here
Good
soon.
for him.
He's phenomenal. And he's tough. He's strong. People will follow him and love him or hate him. He's talented, right? And I love that about the guy. But how do you think he feels when there's this constant narrative that, oh, if you're black, you're oppressed and you've got to work twice as hard to get where you're going? And he's like starting to probably think, well, luckily the people that know me know I got here because I'm good at what I do. But anyone who meets him for the first time probably wonders, are you a diversity hire or are you a talented leader? And he knows he's a talented leader, but anymore, that's the kind of position we're putting our troops in.
That's a shame.
But as we constantly focus on race, like people don't want to be the object of your race discussions. They just want to serve in uniform and be considered equals.
Amen. Amen. Well, we got to talk about the big incident that you had on Friday in Fayetteville, North Carolina. You had an opportunity on Fort Bragg, or formerly Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, I believe. You had an opportunity to be on stage with President Trump to talk about some key issues. And so tell me about that experience and your potential future career working in, if he wins in November, working with his administration to cut out some of that permissive influence in our military.
Yeah, it was nearby Fort Bragg. There were a lot of veterans in the audience. I wasn't looking for the opportunity. The opportunity didn't even know it was looking for me, but the event organizer on a whim. Let me back up and say this, because I don't think I've said this publicly ever. I've told friends and family this, but it's worth sharing in a public setting. I had a dream in January of 2024 that I'd be meeting President Trump and that there were some very specific things that I should say. And it shaped what happened when I ended up on stage with him last Friday. And so it was really a God-orchestrated series of events, and I can't deny it. So I should say that publicly, even if I don't say it often.
Amen.
This woman called me a couple days before the event, said, I know it's short notice, but your name has come strongly recommended. Can we get you as a plant in the audience to read a question that we give you, and maybe you'll get a few seconds of FaceTime with the president. And I thought, oh, maybe this is the opportunity I'm supposed to take. And so I agreed, and I flew out there. And the whole time I was en route, I was getting text messages from the event organizers who said, well, no guarantee you're going to get the FaceTime you're hoping for. No guarantee you'll get to ask the question. No guarantees. And I thought, well, if it's supposed to happen, it will. I didn't have my hopes up for anything. Nothing was pre-staged or planned. And when I got to the event in Fayetteville, it was Friday afternoon. They took a number of veterans backstage, and they handed us a card with a canned question. You didn't really get to say who you were. It was, hi, my name is Matthew, and will you please tell us how you're going to avoid World War III? That was my question.
Right.
And I sat on the stage for an hour, which I also didn't know I'd get the opportunity to do, but they seated me on the stage. Some others were seated in the audience. And as I tried to listen, it was very hard to hear, but as I tried to listen to the unfolding of this town hall where there were questions being asked of President Trump and answers he was giving, I thought, he's already talking about war with Iran, Israel. He's talking about war with Russia, Ukraine, and war and our enemies, North Korea. He's talked about China. He's talking about how tough he is and how tough the military is. And I thought, I'm not going to ask this question that they've given me, even though they told us very straightforward, do not depart from the script that we've given.
That would be duplicative. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's like, we don't want to screw this up. You stay on script, all of you little plants that we've got staged here. And I sat there really conflicted in soul, because integrity matters to me and doing my mission on this earth matters to me. And I thought, I'm not here to ask their question. I'm just not. Like, that's not why this has been arranged. I'm here to ask my question. And it was something like introducing myself, saying I was an F-15 pilot and that I'd been fired from my command in the Space Force that he created because I criticized the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that were rotting the military. That was important context for the question I wanted to ask and suggest to him. And I said, you've suggested firing these general officers, bravo, but it's not going to solve our problems. We've got a problem that is going to remain. We've got a problem. I don't know who, it's not President Trump, so I'm not answering it. That's going to remain in the military unless you have persistent oversight of this for the 4 years of your administration. You get a task force created or a special office or a person in charge of making sure that this never rears its ugly head again. And all the monsters that are pursuing it need to be gone from the military is the bottom line. And so I'm saying that to him like 4 feet away from him, and he's staring me in the eyeballs. And I had the feeling this guy's about to hire me to do that job. I just felt it coming. And he turned and said something to the audience that I couldn't even hear, and the whole audience cheered. And so I figured that's what happened. He just basically said, well, I'd like you to be on that. And I had that confirmed first after the event was over and the cameras were off. He came up to me personally, and he shook my hand again. And this isn't on camera, so no one's seen this. And he hit me in the shoulder, and he said, I know my men when I find them. I'm bringing you with me to the White House. And he says, and then he said, willing, I will end up in the White House. You're coming with me.
That's incredible.
It was a really incredible thing, and I knew that God orchestrated it. It's not like I had no business being there. The event organizers didn't know who I was. Trump didn't really know who I was. I don't even know if he'd heard my story before. And then he pointed out the former Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs, whose last name is Wilkie. Mr. Wilkie was down there. He said, go get in touch with him and get him your resume, and we'll get things rolling. And then I flew home, and I've been thinking about it ever since, not knowing if my life's about to change and in what ways. But my wife and I have just decided, we're kind of happy not moving again. We've done that our whole lives in the military. Let's just stay put. But if that call comes,
what an honor
you don't deny that. Like, you go do that, right?
Exactly.
So that's what happened last Friday. It was a really remarkable thing.
Good for you. God bless you. That is absolutely a God thing. I would completely agree. I'm a man of deep faith as well, and I think that there's definitely no denying that you have a bright future, my friend. And it would be an absolute honor for us as Americans to have you serving in public office in some way, in the administration, in a oversight capacity, wherever it is that you can end up. I think that would just be such a remarkable influence on this country.
Thanks, Cameron.
I really want to praise you for that. And I think I was probably one of millions of people that was watching that going, as soon as this happened on stage, a moment of great emphasis and just a lot of jubilation. I want to be sensitive of your time here, and you've been extremely excellent with your remarks. I want to reflect on a lot of what we've covered and I'll ask my final 2 questions together. If you could go back, what would you have done differently based upon your experiences? And maybe the answer is nothing, and that's a perfectly valid answer too. And then secondly, what are your final remarks that you want to fill people with, you want to leave with our listeners and our viewers? Again, the audience for Feds for Freedom is predominantly people that have been opposing the federal vaccine mandates and opposing this huge abuse of authority, which I believe is due to the inculcated Marxism and perpetuance of tyranny within our government because of their world. But what would you do differently if you could go back? And then what is your final remarks you would have for our listeners based upon everything that we've gone through in the past couple decades?
There are a number of different ways to answer that. Let me say, with regards to my stance against DEI, the writing of a book, being fired from command, and then trying to be an outspoken advocate for our troops against all of that stuff, there's not anything I'd really do differently in any kind of a substantive way. And the reason I answer that way is because I've been trying all along to live true to my conscience. I've been trying to speak the truth. I've been trying to be an honest and decent person and to exhibit courage. And so you don't regret living that way, even if you've made mistakes along the way. And I've certainly made mistakes. I've said things I shouldn't probably. That doesn't really bother me much. And you make enemies in some ways. You gain new friends that you didn't suspect in others. So, and that ties into the advice I'd give the listener, is that I think people are hungry for, in their own lives and in the public sphere, authenticity, integrity, honesty, even if they don't always agree with someone's views. Like, I don't agree with Robert Kennedy Jr.'s views on everything, but I've listened to him carefully, and I've thought a number of times, well, this man says what he believes, and he's really trying to pursue what he feels is his calling or mission. I wasn't going to vote for him. I'm using him as an example. There might be other Elon Musk. I don't like everything he says, but I think, man, this guy's been a champion. He plays an important role. I think he's trying to be a man of integrity, which is really remarkable given that he's been the wealthiest man on the planet and one of the most powerful people on the planet. Like, there's something different about him. And they're not even the best examples. They just come immediately to mind. There are average, everyday men and women who you'll never hear about, who the American people will never hear about, but who are living their lives in a way that is consistent with their inner convictions. That's integrity. And so if we can seek and learn the truth, if we can live consistent with our convictions, and if we can always be honest and align our voice and our words with those convictions that we have, I think our country would be a far better place, and we might be able to buy ourselves more time as a country. And you'll end up with some of the right people in office, and serving in important local and federal level offices. And I think that one of the things that's lacking in even talented politicians is that people can sniff out their inauthenticity pretty quickly, and that they have some other ulterior motive or ambition. And I've often opened remarks that I give on a public stage by saying, I'm not running for office. That's good and bad, because I'm going to say things how I see them.
Right.
And you're going to get to hear an authentic, honest worldview from me, whether you like it or not. And I'll tell you how freeing that's been. I don't regret one bit of that. It's been really nice to live that way. And but there's consequences. I think it's Jordan Peterson. I heard him say a couple of years ago, and he's repeated this in various different ways. If you really want to learn to live the courageous life, try being a Christian and conservative in the modern context, and try being honest and open with your worldview.
Yeah.
And do that on a college campus or do it in a military setting. Then you're really in for a journey. Speak the truth and live with the consequences, and see what kind of a human you really are. And it's difficult, and it's also liberating and empowering.
That is wonderful. Such great advice. Live with authenticity every day, every moment, every chance you have. That is so excellent. Really remarkable. And then, I was really glad to hear that you weren't going to wish anything had been different, because we need people who are bold and courageous, who are saying, my career be damned. There are things that are more important and that are more eternal here, that are worth fighting for, that are worth sacrificing my comfort for. I've lost friends overseas. I'm sure you have too. You've known great Americans who have bled and died in soil overseas, and they were willing to put their lives on the line because they believed in the hope of something that was more important than just their own lives. And we all need to get back to that too. So, Matt, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Again, please, all of our listeners, go out there, buy his book, Irresistible Revolution. It is a remarkable read, such great history, but also just a story of absolute courage. And that is what we lack today. We lack people of conviction and courage. So, Matt, God bless you, my friend. Thanks for being on here, and it's an honor to have you.
Pleasure to meet you.
Absolutely. Cheers. Hey, y'all. Thank you so much for tuning in on this week's post of the Feds podcast. We had a fantastic guest, Lieutenant Colonel Matt Lohmeier, who made waves and is opposing this radical progressive inclusion of politics into our military. Thank you so much for standing by and listening to his words. Again, a man of great courage. We encourage you to follow the Feds podcast. Listen to us as much as you can. Please tune in for more amazing guests here to come. Feds for Freedom.